There is going to be a focus on the military fighting throughout this series, starting next episode, but it's worth explaining the context of the Baltic States in World War II so that we have a clear idea of the area the Axis and Soviets are fighting over, and understand what motivated some of the Baltic units that were fighting on either side. Many of the books in English, some translated from German, like to emphasise the Soviet atrocities that took place during the fighting, and don't mention the German atrocities, even though there were many. They also don't explain the context of the Baltic States in this period very well, giving an impression that everyone was pro-German. Ultimately, they're trying to justify the Wehrmacht and National Socialism and whitewash them of their crimes. Many of the books were written during the Cold War, some by Germans, and they're playing on the anti-Marxist mentality that the West has. So let's try and strike a balance in the narrative between the two ideologies. Now, it is natural for human beings to favour one side or another, Team A versus Team B. But as you watch this series, remember that this isn't a football game. We shouldn't cheer either side on the Axis-Soviet front. Keeping the fate of the Baltic States in the back of your mind, as but one example of the horrors therein, will ensure that you view the Axis and Soviets with equal disgust. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania share a similar tragic story. Essentially, they were all dominated by foreign powers for around 700 years. Then, on the 16th of February 1918, Lithuania became independent from Germany, although it wouldn't be freed from German rule until the November time. On the 18th of November 1918, Latvia declared her independence from Russia, and Estonia did the same on the 24th. Latvia and Estonia won the following wars of independence and became democratic republics along with Lithuania. Skipping forward to 1939, all three states had lost their democratic status and were replaced by dictatorships, mainly due to the economic or political crises of the interwar period. In all three cases, anti-Bolshevik and anti-Soviet sentiments led directly or indirectly to those dictatorships. Then, at 0200 hours on the 24th of August 1939, barely 20 years after their independence, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. This carved up the Baltic nations between National Socialist Germany to the west and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR or the Soviet Union, to the east. In order to protect Leningrad from potential threats, the pact secretly assigned the Baltic states to the Soviet sphere of influence. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the regions making up the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the northern frontier of Lithuania will simultaneously serve as the frontier of the spheres of interest of Germany and the USSR. In this, Lithuania's interest in connection with the Vilnius district is recognised by both parties. Hitler invades Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and Stalin does the same on the 17th. But the Western Allies only declare war on Germany, not the Soviet Union. This gives the Soviets a free hand on their secret claims. Hitler had also called for all Volksdeutsche, the German people outside of Germany, to come Heims ins Reich, home to the Reich. 60,000 Volksdeutsche in the Baltic states did move to Germany during this period, as did some Jews, who apparently feared the Soviet Union more than the National Socialists. On the 18th of September 1939, a Polish submarine called the Orzeł, which had docked in Estonia, now decided to flee to Britain. Stalin used this as proof that the Estonians were not neutral and gathered 160,000 troops on the Estonian border. On the 28th of September 1939, Estonia had no choice but to sign an agreement allowing 25,000 Soviet troops into their territory. This was bad, since the entire Estonian army was just 16,000 men strong at this time. Then, on the 4th of October 1939, Latvia met a similar fate, as Moscow forced Latvian politicians to accept 30,000 Soviet troops into their territory. The Lithuanians were forced to give Memel to the Germans and found the rest of their country occupied by Soviet troops as well. Fearing total annexation by the Soviets, the Lithuanian president, Antanas Smetona, actually offered his country as a protectorate to the Germans, but it was no use. Soviet troops in the Baltic countries were ordered to keep a low profile at first, but by the summer of 1940, the situation had changed. On the 14th of June, Molotov demands the dissolution of the Lithuanian government in order to set up a pro-Soviet government in its place. The Lithuanians bowed to Soviet pressure on the 15th. Similar ultimatums to Estonia and Latvia were delivered on the 16th. They all considered resistance, but without outside support, they knew they'd stand little chance. On the 17th of June 1940, as the West was distracted by the fall of France, the first Soviet troops occupied Latvia and Estonia and took control of everything: the government and the economy. Social ownership and control of the means of production had arrived in the Baltics, and in order to make it seem that this was a legitimate act, as though the Baltic peoples wanted this to happen, the Soviets called elections in the 3 Baltic states. Voter turnout was remarkable, with one precinct in Lithuania achieving 122% of voter turnout. Obviously, it was all totally above board. So enthusiastic were the people to have everything they owned taken off them and their countries dissolved, that the results of the elections were announced in Moscow before the vote had even finished. Once the people's parliaments were elected, they voted themselves out of existence. The 3 Baltic states were now assimilated into the Soviet Union, each becoming Soviet Borg republics. For some reason, the Baltic people weren't happy. Some even took to the forests to fight against the Soviets. Others sung patriotic songs in defiance. But resistance is futile. Patriotic songs would do little when your property is seized and you're killed or deported to the Gulag slave labour camps in the east. This is what happened to the Baltic peoples over the next 12 months, a period known in Latvia as the Year of Terror. Civilians branded bourgeois nationalists, or opposed to the Soviet takeover, were deported to the USSR, with 15,000 people sent to Siberia on the night of 13th to 14th of June 1941 in wooden cattle wagons. The majority would not return. People were arbitrarily separated into social groups. Those deemed to be the owner class, or anyone who might be a threat to the Marxist-Socialist state, were to be either killed or enslaved. 60,000 Estonians, 35,000 Latvians, and 34,000 Lithuanians would disappear, and the majority would die on the journey to, or in, the Gulag. It was the same in Poland, where 1.5 million Poles would be enslaved and sent east. The infants, the sick, and the elderly were hit the hardest by poor conditions, poor rations, cold, and disease. More roundups were planned in the future. Fear gripped the entire eastern population. The police were disbanded and replaced with communist militias. individuals were banned from owning anything, and businesses were seized to be controlled by central administrations. Youth and student organizations were dissolved, and new state-run organizations took their place. Books were burned. The culture and life of the Baltic peoples was suppressed. The workers did receive large pay rises, but since production didn't increase, this only led to massive inflation. And now that trade wasn't allowed with the West, and there wasn't any incentive to work, which hurt production levels further, there were fewer goods in the shops, leading to fewer things to buy. Money is worthless if you can't buy anything with it. So, despite wage increases, the Baltic peoples soon became worse off than they were before the occupation. Ironically, while a higher proportion of Jews in the Baltics were deported than the rest of the population, the Jews were seen as non-national, international, and thus pro-Soviet, since Marxist-Socialism is international socialism, and thus were blamed for the situation that the rest of the Baltic peoples were now in. Some Jewish workers did take jobs in the Soviet-imposed administration, but while they were the minority in that administration, the number of Jews in the administration formed a larger proportion than the Latvian or Lithuanian populations. So there was resentment from the rest of the Baltic peoples, as it appeared to them that the Jews were being favoured more than them by the socialist government. Latvians and Lithuanians, who had also joined the Soviet administration, wanted to distance themselves from their collaboration, and so they blamed the Jews to divert attention from their own failings. As a result, anti-Semitism actually increased in Lithuania and Latvia because of the Soviet occupation, which explains why Lithuanians and Latvians initially assisted the National Socialists when they launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941. Crushing all opposition, the Germans reached Latvian territory by the end of the first day. By July 1941, the Germans had taken Riga. Lithuanians and Latvians celebrated the arrival of the Germans as liberators, but not all of them. Instead of showering their liberators with flowers, the Jewish communities locked themselves into their homes and drew their curtains. When German troops marched into the Lithuanian capital, Kaunas, a Lithuanian provincial government had already taken control in the vacuum of the Soviet collapse. They were now trying to recreate an administration and were looking forward to Lithuanian independence. But the National Socialists would have none of that. As Hitler makes clear in Mein Kampf and in his second book, they wanted territory, resources and slaves for their people's state, not free independent states. The Germans effectively blocked this provincial government from implementing policies and disbanded them after 6 weeks. Instead, the National Socialists established General District Lithuania and ruled over the country with an iron fist. Similar events happened in Latvia and Estonia. The National Socialists were not interested in allowing any concept of nationalism to form in the Baltic States. Self-government was not even on the cards, despite many Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians hoping it would be. Einsatzgruppe A and various security units, including Security Divisions 207 and 281, who we will be seeing of later, accompanied the forward German army units into the capital cities. They set up volunteer detachments of local Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians to round up and deal with the Jews. And so the killings began. Stahlecker's Einsatzgruppe A shot at least 200 civilians in cold blood in Garsden, Lithuania, although the number may be as high as 800. Their crime? was being a Jew. German police encouraged Lithuanians to take up arms against their Jewish neighbours. Yes, neighbours were now arbitrarily separated into different social groups again, this time on racial grounds rather than class. In the capital, Kaunas, 1,500 Jews were murdered and synagogues were burned in an orgy of violence on the 25th to 26th of June 1941. On the 4th of July, Einsatzgruppe A shot another 500 Jews in Kaunas as well, and another 2,514 on the 6th of July. One source states that Einsatzgruppe A alone ran up a total of 138,000 Jews killed by February of 1942. Ghettos were set up in places like Kaunas and Riga. The town of Jelgava was an important railway hub, which we'll see throughout this series, and it was also where Einsatzgruppe A murdered 1,550 Jews. In Riga, 400 Jews were killed as well, and the port of Liepaja also saw more shootings on the 29th of June and the 3rd of July. The number of murders just keeps going up. In 1942, Salaspils concentration camp was set up southeast of Riga. Malnutrition, illness and death in the camp cost the lives of 250 to 650 children. There was also a total of 2,000 dead out of 21,000 prisoners between May of 1942 and September of 1944. 1,000 of these deaths were Jewish. 4,000 were then transferred to Poland and Germany, where many were killed. I shall point out that the Soviets later exaggerated the deaths to 100,000 and told of medical experiments on children, which were untrue. However, there was great suffering and death in the camp. So, yes, in time, the initial joy of being freed from Soviet occupation disappeared from Latvia. The Nazis pulled down Latvian flags, outlawed the national anthem, disbanded their attempt at self-governance, and murdered Jews. 15,900 Latvians alone were sent to Germany as forced labourers. It was a new reign of terror, similar to that which the Soviets wrought upon their country. Now, by the time 1944 rolls around, it looks as though the Germans would be pushed back and the Soviets would conquer the states once more. This problem divided society. Some welcomed the Soviets back, while others were afraid of Soviet rule. Most hated both, but it was like trying to decide the lesser of two evils, with the hope that Hitler may still grant them independence, even though they had never been promised it. Some fought with the Estonian and Latvian Legions, Waffen-SS divisions made up of Estonians and Latvians. Others, including Lithuanians, joined police and auxiliary forces. When the Soviets rolled back into the Baltics, many were then forcefully recruited into the Red Army. During the course of this series, we will see how Latvians fought Latvians at Courland. It's worth noting that animosity exists because some fought for the Germans and others fought for the Soviets. As Hunt points out in the book Blood in the Forest, Russians and Germans, still to this day, think that if you point out that the Latvian legionaries were just fighting for an independent Latvia, they'll accuse you of glorifying Nazis. Clearly, emotions still run wild. So, who is right and who is wrong here? Well, what's interesting is that it is often said that they were volunteers, willing to fight for the Germans. But is that really the case? Legally, these were deemed volunteer units, but in fact the Germans used the conscription laws of the defunct Latvian Republic as a pretext to compel young men to choose either labour or military service. I guess we're glorifying National Socialists and Marxist-Socialists by saying the Baltic States were caught between two evil regimes and were forced to fight for one state or the other. No. While it is very much up for debate, it appears as though these soldiers fought in hope of freeing their own countries, and this was recognised at the time by the Western Allies, at least. All they wanted was independence, a notion which had been crushed by both totalitarian ideologies. Unfortunately, they weren't going to get it from either side, but they didn't know this at the time. It's also worth noting that, with the exception of the Arash battalion, the rest of the Latvian SS didn't kill Jews. Does that mean we're glorifying Nazis by stating this? Well, as Hunt makes clear, no, not in the slightest. Socialists may see the world in groups and find people guilty by association because they were the same class or gender or race, but the reality is that people are individuals. Individuals should not be found guilty just because someone else was found guilty because they were part of the same social group. That makes no sense. This would be like saying all Jews are bad, or all bourgeoisie are bad, or all men are bad, which would be incorrect. So judging everyone who fought for the National Socialists or the Marxist-Socialists and calling them all evil would be wrong. Only those that actually committed or encouraged the crimes are guilty. This might be an uncomfortable truth for some, but the evidence and reality is clear. The Baltic States were caught between two evil regimes, two evil ideologies, two evil empires. This wasn't their war, but they were forced to fight within it. This is the tragedy of the Baltic States. In the next episode, we'll get into the fighting itself, looking at the period between the Soviet summer offensives and the end of August 1944. This will show the events prior to Army Group North falling back into the Courland pocket. We'll be looking at the Soviet advance to the Gulf of Riga, which traps Army Group North in Estonia and northern Latvia, and Operation Doppelkopf, the German panzer counterattack designed to free Army Group North from that trap. Operation Doppelkopf is a very interesting battle in itself, especially for the year 1944, since it used 5 panzer divisions, 1 panzer grenadier division, and more panzer and Sturmgeschütz units as well. That's a huge force of armour and motorised units all in one operation, which somehow didn't guarantee success. Yes, the elite divisions of the German army were massed together, but the Red Army was ready for them. The National Socialists are on the run. Can they weather the Soviet summer storm? Thank you very much to my patrons for supporting me. You made this series possible, and thank you all for watching. Bye for now.